At dinner, Stalin remarks that to stop a third European war, he says at least 50,000, perhaps 100,000 of the German High Command must be physically liquidated. And Churchill just lost his cool. He called this barbaric, and he said, the British Parliament and people will never tolerate mass executions. So Roosevelt comes in to say, let's just calm things down a bit here. And he says, maybe we can have a compromise. What about shooting only 49,000 Germans? And Churchill just stomps out of the room in disgust. And as he goes, Stalin says, you are pro-German.
Hello and welcome to Creating History, and a series of podcasts exploring pivotal summit meetings where leaders, strategy and history collide on the world stage. I'm Russell Barnes, filmmaker and producer.
And I'm David Reynolds, author and historian at Cambridge University.
In this episode, we're exploring the Tehran and Yalta summits between the so-called Big Three of Allied leaders in World War II, American President Franklin Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Josef Stalin. At Tehran in late November 1943, the Allies hammered out their strategy for defeating Nazi Germany. And meeting again at Yalta in February 1945, they attempted to lay the groundwork of a post-war world as the war entered its final months.
Yes, frankly, I think, Russell, these were the most consequential summits of World War II, arguably of the 20th century. They resolved some key disagreements among the Allies, but they also exposed deep tensions that would go on to shape the Cold War and the entire post-war order. And on the human level, the summits are also fascinating psychological encounters. They're marked by competing visions and clashing personalities. Of course, Yalta's the more famous, and indeed it's notorious. It was denounced by Gaullists in France and the Republican right in the US as the moment when the Allies divided up Europe between them, handing over Eastern Europe to Stalin. But I think we've really got to start with Tehran because it was the strategy agreed there that set up the diplomatic parameters of Yalta. The fate of Europe was decided not at the conference table in 1945, but on the battlefield in 1943 and 1944.
Okay, David, well, let's start with that battlefield. What was the state of the war in late 1943?
Well, the tide of the war had turned decisively during 1943. The Allies were now on the offensive all across the map. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union had secured a major victory against Nazi Germany at Stalingrad in February, followed up by the Battle of Kursk in the summer. That's known as the largest tank battle in history. These victories pushed the Germans into retreat. And by the time the Tehran conference began in November 43, the Red Army had liberated the whole of Ukraine in a matter of months. So the point is that Stalin came to Tehran just bursting with confidence. I don't think he would have agreed to meet Roosevelt and Churchill until he'd had such epic victories which put him in such a strong position. Meanwhile, throughout 1943, in the West, the US had been mobilizing its vast resources. The British and American bombing offensive on Germany, from the Ruhr right across to Berlin, was now really gaining momentum, aimed at crippling German industry and sapping civilian morale. And in the Mediterranean, the Allies had driven the Germans out of North Africa and then invaded Sicily and mainland Italy, ousting Hitler's Axis ally, Benito Mussolini, in July 1943.
The Americans and British then were established on the continent of Europe, in Italy, and that was a real milestone.
Mm-hmm.
But the Mediterranean strategy, attacking Hitler through his soft underbelly, as Churchill called it, was now causing growing friction between the Allies.
Yes, it was. Stalin had long been impatient for what he regarded as the real Second Front, and that had to be in France to relieve pressure on the Red Army in the East. Remember, the Soviets had to bear the brunt of the fighting against Germany, in 1941, 42, into 43, suffering enormous casualties. Now, Stalin had tolerated Churchill's Mediterranean strategy in 42, but he was furious that the PM kept it going in 1943. And he was now insinuating that the Western Allies were deliberately delaying the Second Front in order to weaken the Red Army. But Churchill was still resistant. This is a man who's haunted by the ghosts of the past, of the Somme and more recently of Dunkirk. He's fearful of a direct assault on France, the losses that might be incurred, and he didn't want to do this until the Allies had overwhelming strength in manpower and firepower. And he realized too, this is a man who understands the role of navies in warfare, he knew that the Allies needed to defeat the Nazi U-boats in order to have secure supply lines across the Atlantic. Otherwise, the reinforcements and supplies couldn't get into France. So while he's building up for this invasion in overwhelming strength, he hopes to at least maintain the Allied advance into northern Italy. He wants to also pick off some Axis islands in the Aegean. But now he's running into real roadblocks with the Americans as well as the Russians. Roosevelt and his advisors, particularly General George C. Marshall, who's the Army Chief of Staff, were increasingly fed up with Churchill's obsession with the Mediterranean. Marshall had no interest in Italy. He was particularly enraged when Churchill was starting to talk in late 43 about an amphibious assault on the Greek island of Rhodes. And he told the Prime Minister to his face, not one American soldier is going to die on that goddamn beach. For the Americans, the Mediterranean had become a real sideshow. So, in summary, the Americans and the Soviets wanted to pin down Churchill on launching a second front in France. And that was going to be the major talking point at Tehran.
Tehran was the first time that Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill had actually met all together in person. And that, I imagine, was a tricky dynamic.
Yes. And also the venue itself gave Stalin an advantage. The meetings were held in the Soviet embassy, which was heavily bugged. And this allowed him to listen in on Roosevelt and Churchill's private discussions. And FDR, it's interesting to note, he'd been keen to stay there in the Soviet embassy because he wanted to show Stalin that he wasn't in cahoots with Churchill.
And at the opening session, things didn't go well for Churchill.
No, Roosevelt made it clear straight off that his view was that the large cross-channel operation, as he put it, should not be delayed by secondary operations. Stalin was even blunter. He said Hitler's trying to keep as many Allied divisions as possible in Italy where no decision can be reached. Was, he said, much better to strike at the heart of Germany through an invasion of northern France. So both those leaders put their cards firmly on the table. Churchill was outvoted. It was 2-1 for Operation Overlord, and that was the name of the proposed cross-channel invasion of Normandy. And they agreed that this would happen in the spring of 1944. And next day, Stalin kind of keeps needling Churchill. Are the British really serious about Overlord? And Roosevelt takes Stalin's side. Again, I think what he's trying to do is show the Soviets that they aren't facing a British-American bloc.
It sounds rather reminiscent of playground politics.
Well, it was a bit like that at times. So, the famous story, but it's a very revealing one. At dinner, Stalin remarks that to stop a third European war, he says at least 50,000, perhaps 100,000 of the German High Command must be physically liquidated. And Churchill just lost his cool. He called this barbaric, and he said, the British Parliament and people will never tolerate mass executions. So Roosevelt comes in to say, let's just calm things down a bit here. And he says, maybe we can have a compromise. What about shooting only 49,000 Germans? And Churchill just stomps out of the room in disgust. And as he goes, Stalin says, you are pro-German.
So Churchill was having a bit of a sense of humour failure there, I think.
Yes. Well, he's tired out. He's overreacting to the gallows humour. But I think there's a deeper level here. He is now almost venting his frustration that Britain is becoming the junior partner in the alliance. Now that the vast power of America and Russia are being fully mobilized. And privately, he mutters that the little British donkey is caught between the Russian bear and the American elephant, which isn't a bad image. So the two, if you like, big beasts favour taking the direct route into the Reich because they have the strength to do so. Stalin's got masses of men and he doesn't care how many he loses. Roosevelt, who's in charge of a democracy, has to be more careful. But the Americans can bring to bear massive firepower. Unlike Churchill, neither of them needs to wait until the Third Reich has been really softened up. So we're at a turning point here. Up to now, Churchill has, if you like, punched above his weight in one-on-one bilateral meetings with Roosevelt and with Stalin. But at Tehran, faced with both his allies at the same time, he begins to sense Britain's diminishing role in the whole alliance.
So overlord was agreed, but there were also some early discussions about what the post-war order might look like.
Yes, that's right, but those were, I think, less conclusive. Roosevelt introduces his vision for the United Nations and his idea of 4 policemen, as he puts it, America, Britain, the Soviet Union and China, maintaining global peace. Stalin's focus is on consolidating Soviet influence in Eastern Europe after the war, and that starts off more arguments with Churchill. And it's interesting that Roosevelt keeps well out of this. For him, the key issue is forging a long-term partnership with the Soviet leader. Indeed, he pretends to snooze when Churchill and Stalin start haggling about Eastern Europe, and he jokes, "I don't care 2 hoots about Poland. Wake me up when we talk about Germany."
So Tehran sounds like it was something of a triumph for Stalin, a score draw, if you like, for Roosevelt, and a real setback for Churchill. Mm-hmm. The summit resolved critical, immediate questions about Allied strategy, but exposed some growing divisions over the future.
Yes. So at Tehran, Stalin secures the second front he wants. He also strengthens his position in Eastern Europe, and those are both defeats for Churchill. For Roosevelt, the summit is a step forward towards his vision of a post-war United Nations, and he's got no compunction about sidelining Churchill in order to achieve that. So this is why I think Tehran's really a turning point in the wartime alliance. Churchill left that conference painfully aware that Britain was now playing a secondary role. So the whole business had been hugely frustrating, and I think this brought him to one of his lowest points of the war. So in mid-December, he stops off in Tunis en route back to Britain, contracts pneumonia, suffers 2 minor heart attacks, and for a day or 2 there's even fears for his life. His wife Clementine flies out to be with him.
It sounds like the big 3 is becoming more like the big 2.5. They would meet again just over a year later at Yalta in the Crimea in February 1945. How had the situation on the battlefield changed through the intervening year, 1944?
Well, Churchill still feared heavy losses landing on the coast of France. But in fact, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, went ahead on the 6th of June 1944. And after a difficult first month, pinned down in their bridgehead close to the coast, the British, American, Canadian armies broke out and quickly pushed the Germans back through northern France. But meanwhile, and this is often forgotten, another D-Day dawns on the Eastern Front. It's little known even today in the West, but this is a campaign that shaped the fate of Europe as much as Operation Overlord. On the 21st of June 1944, the Red Army unleashes its summer offensive into Byelorussia, codenamed Bagration after one of the Tsarist generals who'd battled Napoleon. and the impact of that advance is devastating. In 5 weeks, while Eisenhower and Montgomery are still bogged down in the hedgerows of Normandy, the Red Army destroys 20 German divisions, drives forward 450 miles to the gates of Warsaw. At this point, sensing that liberation is dawning, the Polish Home Army in Warsaw rises up against the Nazis. But the Germans put the rising down with great brutality, and the Red Army stands by and doesn't intervene to help the Poles.
What lay behind that?
Well, you have to say Red Army is genuinely exhausted, probably in no condition at this stage to assault a well-defended city. But Stalin, quite accurately, views the Warsaw Rising as a deliberate attempt by the Poles to liberate their country from the Nazis before it fell under Soviet rule. So he offers no help for the Rising. Churchill's furious. He presses Stalin for aid. And again, Roosevelt just keeps out of the argument. So Stalin will eventually advance into Poland when he and his armies are ready to take firm control. The fate of the Poles, the Warsaw Rising and its aftermath cast a very long shadow over the alliance.
Looking for a true crime podcast that goes beyond the headlines?
When I interviewed her 20 years on, she said that Fred told her there were hundreds of bodies buried in Gloucester.
It's a deeply disturbed love story.
Join Sky News crime correspondent Martin Brunt and journalist Helen Fospero on True Criminals, a weekly deep dive into the cases that shook the world, with insights so shocking they still haunt our imagination today. This is True Criminals.
When Gareth was 14, he was in a relationship with an attractive young teacher at his school, and he thought he was the luckiest boy in the world. But when she walked out of his life, everything started to unravel. 35 years later, everyone's acting like it never happened, and Gareth wants to understand why.
How about the truth? How about we do that first and then we work out where we're going to go from there? How about the truth?
This new 4-part series is about who gets to be a perpetrator and a victim. To listen, just search for Lucky Boy wherever you get your podcasts.
So, by the time of the Yalta summit in February 1945, the Western Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine, but by now the Red Army was driving into Germany from the east. The war in Europe was clearly in its end game, and with the Soviets in a dominant position. So for the Western Allies, Yalta must have been about shaping the peace in Central Europe.
That was certainly Churchill's perspective, and he was trying to strike spheres of influence deals in parts of Europe to sort out where the Soviets would be strong and where they would be less dominant. But Roosevelt was not interested in the nuts and bolts of post-war Europe, and in any case, he was in no shape for dealing with Stalin. Travelling to and fro from the 1943 summit at Tehran had been a huge undertaking for a man who we have to recognise as a wheelchair president, someone who concealed his disability but had been unable to walk unaided since his battle with polio in the 1920s. So this is a man with limited physical capacities, and he's worn out by that journey to and from Tehran. Now, in the usual way with Roosevelt, he dismisses fuss about his condition, but eventually his daughter persuades him to have a thorough medical checkup. The results are dire. Advanced heart disease, high blood pressure, iron deficiency, and a whole lot of other ailments. Now, I think there's no doubt that Roosevelt's poor health limited his ability to keep on negotiating intensely with Stalin day after day. But on the other hand, I don't think that was of decisive importance at Yalta, because, if you like, his essential approach to the Soviet Union had been decided long before, namely to build a strong personal relationship with Stalin, and that wasn't affected by his health.
Given his health, though, why was the summit held at Yalta so far over to the east in Crimea?
Well, another win for Stalin. He had rejected all sorts of Mediterranean venues like Cyprus, Sicily and Jerusalem on account of his own health. But at root, I think he was scared of flying. He didn't want to move far beyond the NKVD's security net, and he therefore insisted on the Black Sea, and his chosen venue was the Livadia Palace, the old Tsarist summer retreat at Yalta. So Roosevelt and Churchill had to go to him once again, and this demonstrated how much they were courting him.
All very convenient for Stalin.
Yes, so the journey is again an epic as far as Roosevelt's concerned. 14,000-mile round trip by sea and air, a really long and arduous journey for someone who's clearly an ailing president, as Churchill and his entourage could see when they saw him at the conference. And when the Allies finally got to the Crimea, they found that this was no holiday resort. This region had just been recaptured from the Germans. Mod-cons were in short supply. The furniture and the beds and so on had to be brought in from hotels in Moscow. The rooms were cold and damp. Senior generals had to line up to use the few bathrooms, and the only thing that was abundant was bed bugs.
Well, it sounds really uncomfortable. And did this affect the dynamics of the summit?
Well, I think it did in a way. The physical discomfort mirrored the tension of the discussions. So each afternoon of this 8-day summit, there's a plenary session involving the big three leaders and about 20 advisors, military or diplomatic, depending on the topics under review. They're sitting around a circular table for 3 or 4 hours. It's long, it's taxing, tempers get frayed. There were jokes that Churchill's agitation level could be measured by his consumption of cigars. And one senior British Foreign Office official, Sir Alexander Cadogan, who had a pretty low view of the Soviets and indeed of politicians generally, he painted a vivid picture of the first day. The president flapped around and the PM boomed, but Uncle Joe just sat there taking it all in and being rather amused. When he did chip in, he never used a superfluous word and spoke very much to the point.
Yeah, and what was that point? What were the different leaders trying to get out of this new summit?
Well, after the huge devastation inflicted by the Nazis on the Soviet Union during the war, Stalin wanted to dismember Germany, breaking it up into small parts. He wanted to extract reparations, payments from Germany as compensation for the damage. And he wanted to create a buffer zone in Eastern Europe to prevent further invasions from Berlin. And that's part of the reason why he was so dogmatic about Poland. And that became a real point of friction with Churchill. Once again, Roosevelt wants to stay above all these specific territorial issues in Europe. His eyes on the big picture. He wants to get agreement on how to defeat Japan. Still in the war, remember, there's a Pacific War that the Allies have been fighting as well, though at that stage the Soviet Union remains neutral. And he also wants to ensure that the United Nations will be the cornerstone of the new post-war order. So on both those issues, Soviet commitments are absolutely vital. They are the essential steps towards a cooperative international system.
So it sounds like Churchill and Roosevelt are really in disagreement about what the most important issues here are.
Yeah, so one of the problems at a summit is if you and your key ally are not really entirely of one mind. And that's definitely the case at Yalta. Churchill's increasingly alarmed by Soviet heavy-handedness in Poland and other countries freed from Nazi rule. And remember, of course, Britain's got a special interest in Poland because Britain had originally gone to war against Germany in 1939 in defense of Poland's independence. So the British thought that the future of Europe, its territorial future and structure, was more important than building the UN. But that wasn't Roosevelt's attitude. And on Poland, Stalin largely gets his way. He secures recognition of the Soviet-backed provisional government in Poland, and he managed to sideline Britain's key ally, the Polish government in exile, based in London. And while Churchill and Stalin haggle, Roosevelt tries to persuade the Soviets to agree to the so-called Declaration on Liberated Europe. Now, that's a rather general agreement promising free elections, democratic governments in liberated countries. Roosevelt hopes that signing this will commit the Soviets to respect countries' independence, or at least to hold them to account if they don't.
Yeah, the declaration sounds a bit like fig leaf for what would be de facto Soviet control of Poland and Eastern Europe.
Yes, and actually Roosevelt's honest about this. To skeptics back in the States, he says, "It's the best I can do for Poland at this time." He's conscious that the Red Army is already in control of Poland, and he isn't going to push as hard as Churchill for grand ideas like free elections and so on. To put it colloquially, I think he feels you don't make omelettes without breaking eggs, and it was just bad luck for the Poles that a lot of those eggshells would be Polish. His top priority, as always, was not to jeopardize relations with Stalin. And this is a reminder, I think, that summit diplomacy like this is always about resolving differences through interlocking compromises and trade-offs. You win some, you lose some, but that means you've got to decide what really matters to you.
And over the UN and the war in Asia, Roosevelt's softly approach did actually seem to pay off.
Yeah. I mean, Stalin doesn't set much store by the UN, but he can see that Roosevelt does, so he plays along. And Roosevelt in return concedes some of Stalin's territorial demands for territory in Japan and China, the Kuril Islands in the Pacific and South Sakhalin. So Stalin, in return for that, confirms that the Soviet Union will enter the Asian War within 3 months of victory in Europe. By that time, they will be able to turn their armies around and move them out to the east of the Soviet Union. Now, it's worth remembering that at this point, Roosevelt's aware of the atomic bomb project in the United States, but he doesn't yet know whether the result will be a war-winning weapon in the Pacific or, if you like, a kind of damp squib. Nobody knows. So in February 1945, when Yalta takes place, the Pentagon considers that Soviet help against Japan is vital. The Red Army could save American lives in bitter fighting across the mountainous terrain of Japan.
So some major gains for Stalin in Eastern Europe and over Asia, but on other areas he came away less satisfied.
Yeah, that's right. Churchill battles really hard on Germany. He resists the clear commitments that Stalin's demanding about how and when Germany might be dismembered into smaller territories after the war, and what kind of reparations would be paid. And remember, this question of reparations is particularly sensitive in Britain because of the economic havoc after the Great War. The undermining of the German economy over war debts and payments, which was generally blamed for the extremist backlash that brought the Nazi Party to power in Germany. And Churchill's also successful in pressing for France to have a seat on the Control Commission for Germany and its own zone of occupation. Again, this reflects particular British interests. Britain needed friends on the continent. If the US reverted to post-war isolationism, as it had done in the 1920s, this remained a fear. He persuades Roosevelt to drop his opposition to France's place as one of the big powers, and that meant that the two of them could outvote Stalin. So there, they are lining up against Stalin. The Allies agree to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones controlled by America, Britain, Russia, and France. And Berlin, though deep in the Soviet zone, is also going to be divided into 4 Allied sectors. So here we see Yalta laying the groundwork for the eventual division of East and West Germany during the Cold War.
It sounds like these decisions resolved immediate issues, but they also planted the seeds of future conflict.
Yes, and that's what often happens with summits, solutions that create problems down the road. The agreements reached at Yalta were presented at first as a triumph of Allied unity, but cracks soon appeared, particularly over Eastern Europe. During March 1945, Stalin tightens his grip on Poland. He fudges the issues of elections and so on. Churchill sends anguished messages to the White House. He's begging for the two of them to make a joint protest, Roosevelt and Churchill, to the Kremlin about what Churchill's already calling an Iron Curtain coming down across Eastern Europe. That's March 1945.
Did these messages sway the White House at all?
Well, not really. Roosevelt is, as usual, coldly realist. And he feels the Poles are a lost cause. He doesn't want friction over Eastern Europe to imperil his UN project. And in fact, by early April, Stalin's dragging his feet on this as well. He's threatening to send only a junior diplomat to San Francisco, where the opening conference of the UN is going to be held. Roosevelt wants that to be a big stage clarion call, if you like, to the world. So in all these areas, relations with the Soviets are getting pretty prickly, and his blood pressure is going up and up. But in April, just days before he dies, Roosevelt urges Churchill to play down the aggro that's happening almost every day with Moscow. As he puts it, to minimize the general Soviet issue as much as possible. Because he said these problems in one form or another seem to arise every day and most straighten themselves out. Now, in fact, the Soviet Union did finally join the United Nations. It became one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, as Roosevelt intended. But Roosevelt's hopes for an eventual alignment of Russia towards, if you like, social democratic values were utopian. Stalin is determined to dominate his conquests in Eastern Europe and to regain control at home. He regards any kind of open politics as a threat to security.
In many ways, that's why Yalta quite quickly became something of a dirty word in the United States. Averell Harriman, the American ambassador in Moscow, felt in retrospect it was a mistake for Roosevelt to travel to Stalin at Yalta, a sign of weakness and done at obviously huge personal cost. In June 1945, the diplomat George Kennan wrote a long indictment of Yalta as a failure to stand up to the Russians. Was Yalta, in your view, another Munich, a story of democratic leaders bamboozled yet again by a dictator? Another round of appeasement, if you like?
Well, unlike Chamberlain's hasty talks in 1938 with Hitler, Yalta was a multifaceted negotiation, and each party came away with something they wanted. Roosevelt got agreement on the UN and a Soviet pledge to enter the war against Japan. Churchill blocked firm commitments on German dismemberment and reparations. He also secured a larger role for France in post-war Europe than either of his partners really desired. And Stalin gained acceptance for his main territorial goals in Asia and agreements that effectively recognized his predominance in Eastern Europe. But I don't think Yalta was the crude sellout claimed by the Republican right in the 1940s as the Cold War began, because the West had effectively surrendered Eastern Europe earlier in the war by not mounting a second front in 1942 or 1943. But you have to say that that would have been impossible without control of the Atlantic and of the air over the Channel. Otherwise, the British, American and Canadian death toll would have been appalling. It's worth remembering that between June 41 and June 44, so that's from Hitler's invasion of the USSR until the Normandy landings, 90% of the German army's battle casualties were inflicted by the Red Army. 9 out of every 10 Germans killed, wounded, missing, prisoner, those casualties are inflicted by the Red Army, which means North Africa and Italy, battles that we remember in America or Britain, are relative sideshows. If Stalin managed to defeat Hitler, he was bound to be in the box seat in Eastern Europe. So that means when Roosevelt and Churchill journeyed to Yalta, they were in a position only at best to ameliorate, make a bit better Soviet influence. Ameliorate is Roosevelt's own word. The real problem, I think, is less what's said at Yalta than in the assumptions behind the words. Both the President and the Prime Minister were right in their view of Hitler without having met him. But direct contact with Stalin seems to have misled them fundamentally.
So they persuaded themselves that Stalin was a man with whom they could do business, perhaps even trust.
Yes. After Churchill returned from Yalta in February 1945, he spoke to his ministers about the conference and he made this amazing comment. Poor Neville Chamberlain believed he could trust Hitler. He was wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong about Stalin. That's an incredible hostage to fortune. And he doesn't abandon that hope of doing business with Stalin. And nowadays, when we think of Churchill in the 1940s, we think of his celebrated Iron Curtain speech at Fulton, Missouri in March 1946. But he wasn't calling there for a Third World War. He was calling for negotiation from a position of strength, which he kept emphasizing would depend on a renewed post-war alliance between Britain and America. And that's why his title for the speech wasn't The Iron Curtain, but The Sinews of Peace. Churchill, no less than Chamberlain, was convinced of his prowess as a summiteer. I think it shows that parleys at the top can be very seductive.
Thank you, David. Join us in the next episode of Creating History to explore how the Cold War reached deep freeze as a young American president, John F. Kennedy, clashed with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev at a summit that almost led to World War III. You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating History. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. It really helps us get the word out and extend our reach. You can follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram and send us your comments and questions there or by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Also, do check out our first series, Creating Churchill, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to buy us or the team a coffee at ko-fi.com, we'd be very grateful. Details of how to donate are in the podcast description. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating History is a Clear Story production.